Hi, everyone. Um, the reason I felt it important to do a book essay, because that's what it is, on the Obama administration, is because I think it's extremely important for progressive people not to create too many illusions about what's around, because they don't help. And to see in quite a hard-headed way what this new administration is, what it represents in terms of foreign policy, imperialist continuity, and what it represents at home. And it's important to do that to understand to what extent it's different and to what extent it is continuing the policies of the previous three administrations, not just Bush and Cheney, but Clinton and Bush Sr. And from that point of view, the balance sheet I have prepared, the Obama syndrome, war abroad, and surrender at home, is not a very optimistic account or a pleasing account of this administration. Now, it's not a pleasant task to write books like this, because, you know, when you see what's going on and read a lot of material which has been published on domestic policies, leave alone on foreign policies, it's striking how conservative the administration has been. Now, I know all the restraints and constraints. I know that we live in a neoliberal period, that despite the crash of 2008, the system and its political leaders have not attempted any serious structural reforms which was, necessary after that crash. And so the crash has not gone away, it's simply been plastered over with sticking plaster. And it is going to worry people, and is worrying certainly progressive economists, many of them who are not that radical, who are saying that it's not going to work. So here was an opportunity for a newly elected president who was not responsible and couldn't be held responsible for this particular economic crash, who had, unlike previous presidents, mobilized hundreds of thousands of young people in this country, brought them out into the streets to help him get elected, and had created the illusion that they would do something. I mean, yes, we can is not a very concrete slogan, but it offers some hope, or at least creates the impression of offering hope. And so young people were happy, they were mobilized, and they thought that some change would take place abroad and at home. The balance sheet is what? Let's first discuss briefly the continuity in foreign policy. Now, the continuity in foreign policy was symbolized by keeping Gates on at the Pentagon, by essentially accepting the view that Petraeus' surge in Iraq had solved the problem, by sticking to Bush's plans on a so-called withdrawal from Iraq without bringing about any change there at all, by pushing these plans through, which are essentially very simple: withdrawing combat units from the main cities of Iraq, building huge military bases in that country, and keeping between 50 and 70,000 troops there permanently. That is what the withdrawal is, and it's not new. The British tried it in the 20s and 30s, exactly the same plan, and it imploded when there was a revolution in Iraq in 1958, and they had to, they threw the British out. And it's very likely in some shape and form, not in the shape and form of the 50s, but a similar thing will happen if these troops stay in there. On Iran, once again, this administration has carried on with the old policies, essentially in the case of Iran, appeasing the Israelis. Because the big pressure for not doing any deal with Iran, both on the nuclear question and generally on other issues, comes from the Israelis, who are prepared to do anything to preserve their own nuclear monopoly. That is what that particular issue is about. And the failure of this administration to break with those policies of the previous administration is not all that surprising, because I remember, as I point out in the book, I was in the Midwest teaching for 4 weeks in Urbana-Champaign, and I saw this young, fresh-faced guy running for the Senate called Barack Obama. And I was at a house of friends, and they said, he is the great hope of the Democrats. And I said, well, let's watch him, because I'm always interested in great hopes. And the great hope was asked, President Bush has said that it might be necessary to bomb Iran and take out their nuclear installations or whatever they're doing, and what would be your position on that? I support the president totally, said the great hope. So that was my first sighting of him, and I just felt instinctively that this is a guy who is really going to try to please, and he is a weak guy in many ways, and is not going to push through some tiny shifts in domestic or global policies. If on Iraq and Iran he made slightly different noises and pretended to switch on to a different mood music, in Afghanistan the message was very different. We're going to escalate the war. We're going to send more troops. The war was renamed not the war in Afghanistan or the war on terror. It was called AFPAC, unifying two countries as part of American strategic thinking. And they've kept their promises on that. They have escalated the war. More and more Afghans are being killed. More US soldiers are being killed. More NATO soldiers are being killed. More Pakistanis are being killed. One of the more grotesque episodes in recent history is that in a part of Sindh where they desperately needed to use the Shahbaz Air Base for helicopters to get relief to the flood victims, because 100,000 flood victims were in a neighboring town being threatened by the water, the government, the health department of the Pakistan government was told that base is no longer available because it is being used by the United States to fire drones against villages in other parts of Pakistan. So this picture of a continuity in foreign policy and an escalation in South Asia is not a very promising one. And there are no excuses for it. The notion that this was a good war, whereas Iraq was a bad war, was always a flawed notion, and now that has become clear. And the destabilization that this is causing now, both the war and the uncritical support of the United States for the elites in Pakistan, is now creating havoc in that country. I have never known it in all the time I've been living in it, writing about it, to be in such a bad state. It is one of the most depressing periods in the history of that particular country, and at the moment there seems to be no solution. In the case of Israel-Palestine, once again, like every other president before him, he declared that we have to bring both sides together. Well, interesting. I mean, you bring both sides together to do what? And it's not worked in the past. This time, the same policies are being tried in a situation where the Israelis have expanded their frontiers yet again, where you've had a war on Gaza backed by the West, given the green light by the European Union and the United States, front of the great Western citizens, many of whom protested, but by and large not all that much. And now what is being done is a deal to totally put the Palestinians on their knees and get them to accept tiny little statelets which essentially will be Western Israeli protectorates in some form or the other.